Good evening. I'm Mike Perham, the Executive Director of the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and we're pleased to host tonight's webinar lecture. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Beth Bailey, who is the Director, Center for Military War and Societal Studies, and a Foundation Distinguished Professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. Dr. Bailey received her bachelor's degree in American Culture from Northwestern University and earned her master's and doctorate degrees in American History from the University of Chicago. Prior to coming to Lawrence, Dr. Bailey served as a professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico and as a professor of history at Temple University. At Temple, she served as acting director for the Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy. Dr. Bailey specializes in the history of relations between the U.S. military and American society, as well as the history of gender and sexuality. A prolific writer, Dr. Bailey was a major contributor to A People and a Nation books. In 2009, she wrote America's Army, Making the All-Volunteer Force, that examines the nation move from a draft to an all-volunteer army in the wake of the Vietnam War. In 2015, she jointly authored Understanding the U.S. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Dr. Bailey's research and writing have analyzed the Army's efforts to create a force that could respond to a rapidly changing and complex international situation. She has suggested that the Army was the institution that most directly confronted the societal changes and movements of the 1960s and their legacies, and the site of critical studies over the meaning of citizenship and its rights and obligations. Dr. Bailey's recent research and the theme that she'll discuss tonight focuses on the armies and issues of race from 1965 to 1985. I would ask you hold your questions to the end. If you note, there's a question icon at the base of the screen. If you would submit your questions there, and then I'll pass them on to Dr. Bailey. At this time, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me just start by saying thanks to Mike Perry for the gracious introduction and also for the invitation to speak tonight. I really wished I could be speaking to you in person in Carlisle, in part so I could use the wonderful USAHEC archives there, but nonetheless, it's a great pleasure to be here and I appreciate you joining me even virtually. So tonight I'm going to talk about a portion of a book that I'm working on. I'm writing right now about how the U.S. Army as an institution tried to manage what many of its members started to refer to as the problem of race, the internal racial crisis and the explosion of violence among the ranks during the Vietnam era. It's a useful time to think about this history in part because of current events. Institutions across the nation, including the U.S. military, are facing renewed calls for racial justice right now. And this is a story about how the Army as an institution confronted calls more than 50 years ago. So, by late 1968, what had been widely heralded as the best qualified, best trained Army in U.S. history was beginning to descend into crisis. As the U.S. death toll in Vietnam approached 35,000, the struggles were not only in combat with a foreign enemy, they were also within the ranks. From mid-1968 on through the mid-1970s, some Army leaders began to talk about racial conflict as, quote, the war within the war. And it wasn't only in the Republic of Vietnam. Racial violence was also exploding on military installations within the United States and in Germany, in Okinawa, in Korea, in Thailand. And it often spilled over into the streets of the surrounding towns and cities. It's not moving. Okay, there goes. Sorry about that. In August of 1968, at Vietnam's Long Binh jail, a group of Black soldiers seized control of that much hated stockade and burned the buildings into smoldering ruins. They also beat a white inmate to death with a shovel. A small group held a portion of the stockade for weeks. They improvised dashikis and African drums, and they claimed Black control over the space. In that uprising, more than 100 men were injured, and the commander, who had gone into the grounds to try to stop the violence on that first night, suffered lifelong brain injury. This event didn't get a lot of attention within the United States because that was the same weekend as the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which had tanks in the streets of Chicago, uneasy echoes today. That same summer, an Army major, a man who had been successful by the standards of his service, had an Army Commendation Medal and a Bronze Star, released a statement to the press claiming that the US Army was the strongest citadel of racism on the face of the earth. He got an article in the New York Times, and it was picked up throughout the country, and he got the full attention of Army leadership. So here we see two different responses to African-American sense of racial injustice. On the one hand, we have men like Major Merritt here on the screen, who called for change, who laid out their case in detail, even if perhaps with excessive claims. And you have events like the LBJ riot or uprising, or the bloody brawl that flowed out of the Seoul Bar Flash Inn during the 1969 Reforger 1 exercise in, quote, icy North Bavaria, or the riot in Anjangni in Korea in 1971, when, as the leading Korean national newspaper reported, Black soldiers were, according to its headline, wronged by whites and taking it out on Koreans. That led to a clash between Black soldiers and 1,000 stone-throwing local residents. And there were also an increasing number of individual assaults which were increasingly and newly mandated for reporting anytime there was cross-racial violence. Unlike Merritt, who made a set of clear, if sometimes overstated claims, these men are not making clearly articulated demands, but they're instead expressing frustration and rage through violence. Now, Army leaders believed that something significant had changed. In the mid-1960s, the US military, and the Army very much included, was generally considered internally and externally a model of racial progress. Time magazine told its million plus readers in late 1966, despite a few blemishes, the armed forces remained the model of the reasonably integrated society that the US looks forward to in a new generation. And Black leaders overwhelmingly agreed. They praised the military for its role in racial progress. They endorsed it as a model for the nation, as an institution where color did not determine opportunity. They didn't deny that there were still problems, but they saw the military and the Army as a model for the future. Within the Army, race merited ongoing attention, but race relations were usually considered a point of pride, not a major command concern. And it seemed even more so as civilian institutions fractured and cities burned. Okay, to make my point, in July of 1967, the Army gave a top secret briefing to the Secretary of Defense on soldiers' morale in Vietnam. And he heard about the use of marijuana and other narcotics, and he heard about the extent of the black market, and he learned about the rates of courts-martial, but he didn't hear a word about race. By 1969, both the Secretary of the Army and the Army Chief of Staff defined race as a key problem the Army faced, second only to the war in Vietnam. This internal violence, this internal warfare, described as the war within the war, demanded attention. Now, Army leaders, most of them white, focused on racial issues for a variety of reasons. Some of them did it because they understood it to be the right thing to do. They were Americans. They had grown up in a nation that still had legal Jim Crow. Many had trained at installations where once they left the post, they were subject to those laws. They saw the broader struggles in the United States. They understood a moral commitment to improve race relations and to work for racial justice. Another reason was pressure from the public. As you all know, the military is subject to civilian control, and the Congressional Black Caucus and other congressional representatives and senators became invested in the issue of racial justice, and to the extent of threatening to hold up money for foreign deployment if race relations were not improved. Stories of race fights or riots found their way into the newspapers all across the United States. The NAACP and the Urban League got involved. There was a lot of pressure being put on the Pentagon and leaders of the individual services. But most significantly, and most in keeping with their mission and their roles as leaders of the military services, the main reason that race hit the top of the long list of Army leaders' concerns was that race relations had gotten so bad, racial violence had gotten so extreme, that many believed that racial conflict threatened the internal stability of the Army and thus harmed combat readiness. If racial conflict undermined the Army's ability to defend the nation at a time not only of the war in Vietnam, but when escalating Cold War tensions and growing instability in the Middle East were making worse an already volatile and dangerous strategic environment, it absolutely had to be addressed. So the Army is confronting what it perceives to be a crisis. It's got to act to solve the problem, but nobody knows what to do. And worse, the problem seems intractable. The resistance, the demands are not coming from an organized movement with appointed leaders. And in part, many of the men who act out of anger and with violence don't seem to respond to the usual techniques of discipline. What are they going to do? Many said, send me to Vietnam. And finally, they were feeling like the situation was intractable because the demands that were made were often in direct conflict with traditional understandings of military life, something that wasn't restricted to African American service members during this time. There were an awful lot of white service members too who did not see submitting themselves to traditional notions of military discipline as something they desired. That's the core of my book. I'm trying to figure out how the Army dealt with demands, with problems that often seem to challenge its own sense of itself, its practices, its institutions, its fundamental logic. I am arguing that the institutional logic of an institution shapes how it defines problems and how it then tries to deal with those problems. And that institutional logic, that set of practices and culture and understandings and sense of mission, may well determine what attempts succeed and what attempts fail. And so today what I'm asking is for you to maybe think through that with me with one long example and one short example. How does the massive institution of the US Army in the Vietnam era attempt to deal with the problem of race? What is it about that institution that shapes its definitions of problems, that shapes what it's willing to try, that helps to determine what works and what doesn't? Okay. Huge problem on the table. And it's in the midst of a whole host of other problems. When Army leaders began to seek solutions, they behaved largely as usual. They turned to the usual approaches of the military bureaucracy. They started to study the problem, but there was a pressure to act and to act immediately. So they turned first to the usual tools that Army leaders used for managing problems: leadership, training. Let me walk you through briefly the complications of trying to address the problem of race through leadership in relation to the Army's institutional logic at that specific moment in time. Okay. Studies and experience determined that junior officers weren't really prepared to deal with racial conflict, especially festering racial tensions. Senior leaders determined that that means they needed more training. Reasonable response. The second thing, though, that seemed clear is that officers from lowest to the top were reluctant to acknowledge when they had a problem. The promotion system, the reward system, did not reward acknowledging problems. It was much better to keep them quiet, to ignore them, to keep them pushed down to a lower level where they festered. So what the Army did was to institute a new category of evaluation on the OER, on the Officer Efficiency Report. How well does this officer manage race relations? It was a huge deal. And there were people whose careers ended over this issue. Next, they had to confront problems with the chain of command. It's the same problem. You don't get rewarded by pushing a problem up the ladder. And that meant that the top command often didn't know when there were problems, and those people in NCOs and more junior officers tended to squash or ignore and let things fester. How does the commander come to understand discontent in the lower ranks? How does the commander come to deal with it? What they did often was to create congresses and conferences on racial harmony and give those groups direct access to the commander. But okay, institutional logic, that's going to create problems. Such access, such direct access, undermines the authority of NCOs and more junior officers. How do they maintain authority when there are men who are able to walk around them and go directly to the command of the entire post installation? The other thing they did was to think more broadly about leadership. Step outside the notion of rank. Are there enlisted men, even privates, who function as alternative leaders, who have influence with others, that could be brought into the fold, who could be worked with, who could keep a lid on things? Are there alternative lines of leadership to be exploited? Once again, tensions with the normal practices of the Army as an institution. They learned that it was often successful if they were able to do that, and it was a growing problem when those men were left on the outside. Often they were able to function in opposition. But what does that mean for the usual Army practice, for the chain of command? What impact is that going to have on rank, order, and discipline? So the answers weren't easy, even for those who clearly saw the problems and had creative solutions to propose. So tonight, I'm going to go into some detail about how the Army responded to a set of demands that fit into perhaps the most fundamental change that was made during this era. The Army led the way in what was a thoroughly striking move. Army leaders rejected the notion of colorblindness, which was its claim to being a model for racial progress, and embraced a race-conscious approach. In 1969, speaking in a path-breaking speech to the AUSA, the Secretary of the Army, Stanley Reeser, said that some leaders will say, with the best of intentions, for me there's only one color, and that's OD, olive drab. And yeah, he said, that's true, to the extent of treating everybody fairly. That still holds. But he said, putting Black and white citizens in green uniforms doesn't mean that their different backgrounds, experiences, outlooks can be ignored. A Negro in uniform, he said, does not cease to be a Negro, language of the time, and become a soldier instead. He becomes a Negro soldier. So in addition to combating racism as a negative force, he argued, the Army needed to define racial identity as a potentially positive force, or at least a force that had to be acknowledged. What then is that racial identity? What did it mean in 1969, 70, 71, 72 to be a, quote, Negro soldier? Obviously, there's no one answer. But for young Black men in the late 1960s and early 1970s, from those who enlisted to the reluctant and unwilling draftees, that question is often front and center. In an era of cultural nationalism, young Black soldiers wanted their Black identity recognized. They sought visible symbols of Black identity and pride. They carried that desire from civilian life into the military. So here's another problem that Army leaders confronted. How can specific racial identity be given space in a uniformed service? Much of that conflict, hair, is encapsulated in a struggle over hair. A report on Army race relations that was done in May 1970, one of those studies, concluded that there is, quote, no single thing that exacerbates and fosters ill will more than the topic of haircuts. A survey at Fort Carson in March 1970, and Fort Carson was one of the places with the greatest unrest, as it had a huge number of Vietnam returnees making up its population. A survey at Fort Carson in March of 1970 about soldiers' concerns and complaints found that 1 in 5 listed hair as their top complaint. 2/3 of them put hair in the top 4. As perspective, stories on the My Lai massacre were still on the front pages, and this was less than 10 months after the Battle of Hamburger Hill. It was in the top 4 for 2 out of 3 soldiers at Fort Carson. When Fort Bragg set up interracial seminars in late 1969 to talk about race and discontent, participants reportedly were preoccupied with hair policy. And journalist Wallace Terry, who was the bureau chief for Time magazine in Vietnam, interviewed hundreds of servicemen, most of them African American, between 1967 and 1969. When he testified for Congress about racial conflict, the only thing that came above hair in the concerns he voiced were slow promotions and disproportionately dangerous assignments. Young Black soldiers wanted to be able to wear an afro, as did their brothers in other services. And Army officers increasingly said, okay. In Germany, Major General Vaughan said that the afro was one of the most important, if not the most important matter of concern to the Negro soldier, a source of great pride and identity to the Negro. Language was still very slow to change. He allowed the wearing of the afro. Okay. This is where the nature of the institution comes in. The afro is a visible rejection of uniformity. It does not fit with Army ways or Army values as articulated at the time. Claiming such visible alternate identities to OD, to uniformed soldier, many people understood that as challenging the primary identity of soldier. It's saying, I am a Black soldier. I am a Black man. Okay, back up, and we'll say what at least some of you were probably already thinking. Those Army ways and values at that moment were not racially neutral. The term for the required uniform haircut was white wall or white sidewall, which kind of clearly refers to white skin, and the term was used as slang for white soldiers. Nonetheless, how did the Army try to manage these desires and demands, even as it had acknowledged them as legitimate, even in just in bits and pieces? And that goes back to, again, how the institution works. The Army, I've said it before, I'll say it again, is a massive institution. Counting the Guard and Reserves in 1970, it was about 2 million people. And it's a complex organization. Even before PowerPoint, there were endless flowcharts of responsibilities. And those responsibilities were meticulously detailed. In 1970, there were 450 MOSs, military occupational specialties, including everything from oboe player to meat cutter. So within the Army, the way that the problem is defined is going to dictate what element of the Army is going to be responsible for solutions. And the problem of race finds purchase throughout the operational and institutional elements of the Army. But the initial organization-wide proposals for dealing with culture and dealing with arguments about the Afro come from the PX. Makes sense. PX officials, whose job it is to provide consumer goods to service personnel and institutions throughout the world, see an opportunity to take the lead and so to acquire credit and resources. And for those of you who know the history of this era, the PX was in huge trouble right at this point with a whole host of scandals. So this was a good move. Leaders recognized that PX stock was aimed primarily at white soldiers and their families, and that many Black soldiers and their families felt ignored. They felt like they were not being treated as full members in the Army. The shelves on PXs were filled with shampoos that promised to bring out the natural highlights and the softness of hair. That wasn't welcoming. So they solved the problem that was within their sphere. The first thing they did was to identify a, quote, urgent requirement to improve haircutting for Black customers, Afros. They located a Black barber from San Francisco who had written about styling Black hair, and they sent him traveling around US military installations, Army installations all over the world. He spent 3 weeks in Germany and England, where he taught 750 barbers and 300 beauticians. And then he did a 40-day whirlwind tour of Alaska, Hawaii, and Southeast Asia. He taught barbers how to cut Black hair. This is him teaching barbers in Tokyo. I gave this a version of this talk in Tokyo in January, and had a lot of requests for copies of this photograph. Afros, yeah, you know, they're sort of modified, but at least they were teaching the proper tools and techniques, and they were guaranteeing that they wouldn't be charged more for Afros than white soldiers were charged for regulation haircuts. It wasn't going to be a specialty haircut, it was just a haircut. Second thing they did was to create a list of ethnic products that had to be in stock everywhere. I can't find a picture of the Army. This is the Air Force. I apologize nonetheless. They committed themselves to serving Black customers. That is a big deal. The PX was the 4th largest retail institution in the world. So when they decided that 1 in 5 dolls they ordered for Christmas would be Black, or that they would stock soul music or Afro sheen, they gave an enormous boost to those companies, and they changed the dynamics of consumer purchasing throughout the world. When PX in Korea ordered 500 Afro combs and sold them out in a matter of minutes, they thought, okay, this is a problem we can solve. This is a problem of inventory and demand. We can do this. And lots of servicemen were very happy about these changes. But Black pride was not simply consumer goods. Black pride couldn't be purchased at a PX or contained by its offerings. So as racial tensions continued to grow and anti-military sentiment spread in the Army, African-American servicemen, African-American enlisted men in particular, started to embrace a set of symbols of identity. They adapted soul bracelets, which were sometimes called slave bands or unity bands or brotherhood bracelets, often woven out of boot laces, not authorized for wear with the uniform. They greeted one another with a dab, a pass the power handshake that could sometimes, some of you may remember this, go on for a very long time. And when people were standing in line trying to get food, this was sometimes purposely meant to annoy and to assert power over the circumstances. They used a Black power salute instead of a traditional salute. That didn't necessarily go over very well. Westmoreland sent this to the commander, and you, sir, this is terrible. What kind of army are you running these days? It's a dilemma for the Army. Expanding PX offerings fits really well into the institutional framework. Seems like a good thing. Recognize Black culture with consumer goods, don't affect the primary identity of the soldier. Cultural symbols and acts, though, they violate a whole range of Army regulations and practices. Signs of individual identity are by nature in conflict with the uniformity necessary to a uniformed service. Alternate group identities challenge the primacy of the identity of soldier. And some of these symbolic acts defied the logic of military order, with its emphasis on discipline, hierarchy, rank, regulation. The dab, does it disrupt the hierarchy of rank? Sure, it's a sign of Black brotherhood, but does the sergeant dab with the private? What about the captain? The clenched fist, Black power salute. Does it symbolize defiance rather than respect? Because it was a moment of crisis, because many African American soldiers felt very strongly about it, it was sometimes accepted. But, well, you see how Westmoreland felt about it. There's a broader issue here, though. If the Army decides to recognize the importance of Black identity and to accept the use of various cultural symbols, even to a very specific end and in a specific circumstance, because of the way the institution works, it can't limit the use of those symbols to African Americans alone. Some of you may see what's coming. If one group's cultural symbols are acceptable, why aren't those of another group? If Black soldiers can display pride in Black identity, why can't white soldiers display pride in white identity, or perhaps in white Southern identity? It's an issue today. It was an issue then. Flying the Confederate flag did not exactly calm racial tensions. But many Army officers, understanding the logic of Army regulation and practice, treated the two as parallel. Fort Collins, Colorado, where the commander at that point issued a statement to all Iron Horsemen insisting that the race problem was not a Black problem, it was a white problem, nonetheless wrote in its report on race relations in 1971, there are no restrictions on Black unity bracelets or the display of Confederate flags. The two are equivalent. Now, the Army solution, which was institutionally brilliant, of course, was to handle it institutionally, at least in Vietnam, MACV. They issued a statement saying that the only flags authorized to be flown are those of the United States, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Minuteman Award. On special occasions, you can fly all the state flags, but only if you fly all the state flags, because the way that many people flew flags that were resonant with the Confederate battle flag was to fly state flags, which during the Civil Rights era had incorporated the Confederate battle flag into their state flags. They didn't say anything about race. They just dealt with flags. The authors continued, though, because they clearly understood what was going on. We can try to require a change in actions and hope that a change in attitude will follow. And here too, this is institutional practice. The Army has much more control over its members than any civilian institution. It can issue orders which must be obeyed. That way it can change behavior, even if it can't change attitudes. Okay, they manage the flags, but what about other symbols? What about other kinds of identity? Can soldiers demonstrate that they belong to youth, to the cool, or the hip? What if their claims of identity have nothing to do with race? By the late 1960s, countercultural styles had merged pretty thoroughly into America's youth culture. And the military, sadly, at that point, was at a low point of respect in the United States. Many young men in the Army wanted to be able to pass for civilian when they were off post. And they were also quite concerned, and I've seen this more times than you can count, that there was no way they were ever going to be able to date a girl that they found attractive if they didn't have long hair. In case you don't remember what hair looked like in the early 1970s, this was considered to be a normal haircut. Okay, so if for Black men, the Afro signaled Black pride, for many young white men, long hair was also a claim of identity. And like the Afro, long hair challenged the primacy of military identity. Not everybody thought the challenge was absolute. And, you know, you serve at Fort Custer, you got a little sense that maybe hair policy has changed over time. But it raised tensions. When the Army started coming up with advertisements to try and think about how to draw civilian young men and women, but in this case men, to join the Army when they knew they were going to lose the draft and have to recruit 20 to 30,000 young men and women a month. One of the first things they did was to go to hair. We care more about how you think than how you cut your hair. This was released before General Westmoreland discovered that it had been released, and he was outraged and sent out a memo saying, this is not, I repeat, not supposed to demonstrate how a young man who was enlisted in the US Army is allowed to look. Okay. But gradually what happened is civilian hair grew longer, the Army let hair get longer. But there's another problem, and it's one probably some of you have thought of: enforcement. Regulations aren't always clear. You can pass inspection in the morning and be disciplined by a different officer in the afternoon. There was a demand on the part of officers and NCOs for, at the very least, clear regulations. And we get institutional practices once again. The Army, is an institution that will specify the brand and color of paint for different kinds of offices. It lives on detailed regulations that govern all aspects of Army life and service. Regulation is the lifeblood of the institutional Army. So they regulated. The series of regulations went from not even mentioning hair beyond saying that military personnel must present a neat and soldierly appearance, to 37 words, which basically goes to well-groomed, to 569 words in the space of slightly more than a year. I will point out that the current hair regulations are more than 2,000 words, which is partly because of incorporating women and because of a greater diversity in the makeup of the US Army today. And they also put out photographs just in case. But the conflict over hair continues, even as racial conflicts start to subside. There are news stories, courts-martial cases, the Army's hair wars, at a time as the military withdraws ground troops from Vietnam and tries to move to an all-volunteer force when there is a marked lack of respect for the armed services among many in the United States. Members of Congress get involved. Pat Schroeder calls for a congressional investigation of Army hair policy. Les Aspin, who was then a member of Congress but would later be Secretary of Defense, wrote this in a press release. He didn't just say it. He wasn't just running on at the mouth. He issued a press release that said that the Army is jeopardizing our military readiness in Europe over a silly issue like the length of a man's hair. That's incredibly stupid, even for the Army. The point is, none of these confrontations were about race anymore. Almost all the soldiers involved by this point were white. Okay, sum up. By this point, 1974, the racial crisis is beginning to subside. Race matters, but it's no longer such a high level of internal violence. And for Black servicemen, for Black soldiers, cultural symbols no longer are nearly so critically important to their claims. Thus, with the question of hair, now separate from the question of race, the Army decided it was time to evaluate lessons learned. As an institution, the Army had never been comfortable with its limited embrace of cultural symbolism, including hairstyles. It had experimented only because it was desperate for solutions to endemic racial conflict within the ranks. And at this point, the Army starts to reassert the claims of tradition, to reassert its usual institutional logic. An official letter on Army hair policy was developed in 1975, and it explained that the Army was not merely an extension of American society, but it was rather a separate and unique institution. And as such, it must retain its basic standards of appearance and dress. Now, soldiers were still challenging Army hair policy, but that was ultimately put to rest in mid-1976 by the U.S. Court of Military Appeals, who ruled following a ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court about civilian police departments. The Supreme Court had said that the civilian police departments were allowed to regulate the hairstyle of their members. Excuse me. In that trial, before the U.S. Court of Military Appeals, Army lawyers argued that a pride and spirit in being a recognizable force and a force whose appearance requires uniformity lay at what was the fundamental grounds for their appeal. They stressed the importance of discipline and uniformity to the institution. So when the Court of Military Appeals upheld the Army's right to regulate hair, It endorsed Army claims about the importance of traditional values of uniformity, of order, and discipline, and said, yes, it is a different institution separate from the requirements that govern civilian society. So that ruling validated notions of military exceptionalism, and it rejected the right of soldiers to express alternate identities to that of soldier. It concluded that the United States Army was a uniformed force separate from civilian society and based in principles of order and discipline. Self-expression through hair too directly violated the institutional logic, practices, and culture of the Army. Ultimately, it said, what was at stake was the right of a military institution to enforce its regulations, something the Army claimed was absolutely fundamental to the subject of its mission, regardless of what the subject of those regulations were. But in the realm of race, the Army's brief experience with Afros and the cultural symbolism of Black pride is going to have longer lasting significance. In an age of cultural nationalism, Black soldiers had demanded the right to express Black pride. They had embraced the Afro as a symbol of Black identity in what was an overwhelmingly white institution. And as the Army confronted their demands in the context of an overwhelming crisis, it tested its own institutional limits. And some of what Army leaders learned or verified was that the institution of the US Army possessed a surprising flexibility. In the face of crisis, the Army could respond creatively. It could bend, at least when under threat of internal violence and external failure. The institution also drew lessons about the tools available for managing change. In the military, hierarchy is clear. Authority reaches well past the boundaries that civilian employers face, and orders are orders with mechanisms for enforcement. That mattered because, as the comments from MacV on the Confederate flags noted, it may be that forcing change in behavior will affect attitudes, and at the very least, it will affect behavior. Nonetheless, as we all know, there's often a great distance between policies and their ground level implementation. But finally, in this process, the Army confronted its institutional limits, the ways in which the weight of organization, culture, history, tradition, logic, policy, practice fundamentally define what will more likely succeed and what will more likely fail. And ultimately, the institution returned to its fundamentals. Military identity must take precedence over all other forms of identity. And uniformity, order, discipline, and regulation must be paramount. In the end, though, there's an additional lesson to be drawn. It was the framework of cultural nationalism that fundamentally shaped and solidified the Army's position that race matters. And it was that position that would make all reforms possible. It was Black soldiers' emphasis on Black identity that fostered the Army's race-conscious approach. And that would make all the difference. By the mid-1970s, the Army, true to its own institutional logic, had concluded, probably for the best, that it was not going to address race in the realm of culture, in the realm of symbols. Instead, it would seek solutions to the evolving problem of race, more in accord with its own institutional values, practices, and understandings. No longer engaging on the battleground of cultural symbolism and identity, but instead taking race-conscious approaches to rank, to leadership, to military occupation and assignment, categories that corresponded more closely to the fundamental logic and practices of the US Army, and which worked much better in the era of the all-volunteer force. Thank you.
Let me come back here. At this time, if anybody would like to ask a question, I would ask that you submit the questions online, and I'll pass them over to Dr. Bailey. If you want to share, we can get you larger.
Okay, let me take this down.
I can take it down. So
okay, thank you.
Down. Let me just see. Oops, wrong one. Stop share. There we go. And I'll make you a little bit, well, I'll stop my video so that you're a little bit larger here on the screen. So far, no questions, but I'll ask one. And it ties in more to the development of the volunteer army.
Okay,
If you look
that's something else I worked on.
look at the combat units that fought in Vietnam, they were normally of mixed race.
Mhm.
Over the
Yeah.
period of the volunteer army, it appears that some of your combat units have become predominantly white or Hispanic, and that African-American soldiers have moved over to the support MOSs.
Mhm.
Is that something that your research has seen, and is that going to provide issues later on for us?
More than likely. So the range of this book really is much more through the period of the Vietnam era. But one of the concerns at the time was that African Americans were highly overrepresented in the combat arms, and that they were in, if they weren't in the combat arms, they were in sort of soft support. And there was a concerted effort to try and make sure that African American service members were moving into other fields. But what has become striking is the extent to which Black men and women have not been choosing combat arms or any forms of close support in recent years. It really jumped with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's much more difficult to assign people to fields that they're not interested in with an all-volunteer force. And so this has become an issue. The ways in which they attempted to address a problem of overrepresentation in the combat arms led to perhaps an alternate kind of problem that exists today.
This question says from Susan. She asked, were more Blacks than white men drafted as a percentage of the society during the 1960s, as you looked at the draft numbers?
No, not really, because there's a really good book by Chris Appy called The Working Class War, and what he shows is the extent to which the Vietnam War was primarily, was heavily fought by white working class men. That said, though, there were a lot of African American men who ended up in combat units, and in the early years of the war were dying at disproportionate rates. And so there was a concerted move to make sure that they weren't overrepresented in those units any further. But it wasn't clear to people, members of the public, exactly what percentages of people were being drafted, and which people got deferments, and which people found ways to avoid service, and where they were sent and where they went. And so there was a very strong perception among African Americans throughout the nation that Blacks were being drafted at higher numbers and were being sent to die at higher numbers. And there was also a fundamental questioning of, in a period where there was an enormous amount of racial conflict and a great deal of discrimination, why should we send our sons to fight and die in a white man's war? So there was a great deal of distrust of the draft throughout the country, particularly among African Americans.
This question is from Dave. Did the U.S. Army share experiences or learn from the other services who are addressing the same issues?
Oh yeah, that's really a great question. So when I showed you the picture of Willie Morrow, the Marines found him first, and it showed up in the Stars and Stripes, and the Army just stole the whole thing. There was a lot of people looking over each other's shoulders, and there was a lot of tension, because if you would have, two different services located in the same area, and they had quite different regulations. Say that the Navy was notoriously lax on hair policy, for example. There would often be conflict. Well, why do they get to do it this way? Why don't we get to do it this way? And there was a lot of cross conversation, and often a lot of tension between the different policies that the services adopted and the ways they tried to solve the problem. But it is interesting the extent to which the Marines sort of got ahead of things, and the Army adopted some of the things the Marines tried first without acknowledging it.
This question's from Ben. I'm going to probably shorten it a little bit, but if you look, have you looked back further to the Civil War units, the African American Civil War units during that time, and how they maybe address some of these issues, but then why does the Army sort of relegate the stories of African-American soldiers to Black History Month and not integrate it into a larger context throughout the year?
That's a very good question as well, and I've looked at the history of African American service in the armed forces overall through secondary sources, but it's nothing I've ever done primary research on or consider myself an expert on. But in terms of attention to African American contributions to the U.S. Army, one of the solutions that was proposed to the problem of race during this era was to more directly acknowledge and make visible the ongoing historical contributions of African Americans. And there was a lot of that done. When you go back and look at the primary sources, it is quite striking how dismissive and ugly some of the coverage was during that period, and the real attempts to change that. The question of, is it relegated to Black History Month, as looking at women relegated to Women's History Month, it's always a bit of a complication. Mike said I'm a co-author of a textbook, and in trying to write about the history of the United States, my sense was that it was very important to weave the actions and contributions of all Americans into the text, and to recognize the ways in which all Americans are part of this story. But when I did that, taking over from somebody else, there were people who said, well, there's no longer a segment that says African Americans in World War II. And I said, yes, but I actually talk about African Americans in World War II a whole lot more than that paragraph with that title, but it's no longer called attention to because it's not separate. So, there's always that kind of tension between how to handle the issue of making sure that sufficient attention is called to the significant contributions by highlighting it in the specific moment or weaving it through a larger story. Obviously, the solution is to do both.
This question's from Al. It looks at the recent letter written by a number of African-American graduates of the military academy that raised concerns about the environment. Is there anything that the Army did in the 60s and 70s, addressing some of the things that you look at, that could be applied to today to help create a better environment based upon those cadets' comments?
Well, I think the fundamental thing that was done in the late 60s and early 70s was concerted attention to the problem of race. Making it a key issue that had to be addressed, had to be dealt with, and commanded attention all the way to the top leadership, that commanded the attention of the Chief of Staff of the Army, the Secretary of the Army, that commanded the attention of every commander of every unit in the nation and beyond. The answers, I think, are different because even as cadets today see continuing problems with the racial climate at West Point, the specific issues they face are different. The climate is different. What they want is somewhat different. I don't think they'd be at all happy if the responses were what they were in the late 60s and early 70s, because they often today would seem patronizing, I think, and would certainly highlight how much has changed since then. Because, as much as race is still the ongoing sin at the heart of the United States, things, trust me, as a historian who looks at that period, things have changed.
Any more questions from the audience? I think we've answered the ones that were submitted. If anybody does have additional questions, I would ask that you email them to us, and I will pass them on to Dr. Bailey, and if she's so kind, she might respond. I would ask those who listen tonight to let their friends know about this broadcast. We will be posting it to YouTube here in the next couple days, and please let them know, because this is an important subject both in our Army's history, our nation's history, and as I think Dr. Bailey said, as much as we see issues today, our nation and the Army has addressed these problems as best they can in its history, and hopefully we continue to do so. Dr. Bailey, do you have any closing comments?
I appreciate the chance to speak with you. It's kind of strange because I don't get any audience response and I can't see your faces and see what's working and what's not. So, thanks for staring at the screen. I am completing a book on this topic, which I hope will be done and out within a year and a half or so. And so I hope you might be interested in reading more about the topic. And if you're interested in the Army in the period following this, at the beginning of the all-volunteer force, maybe take a look at America's Army, which I completed largely using the resources offered at MHI then in Carlisle. So thank you for hosting me now and for all of the help you've been all over these years.
Well, thank you.